The king lay dying, bloated, rotting, and reeking of death. Once a golden prince, now a decaying monster surrounded by silence. Even his servants feared the final breath. This was Henry VIII. Not the man from schoolbooks or oil paintings, but the tyrant hidden behind the crown, the husband who murdered wives, the friend who executed allies, and the sovereign who tore a nation in half for his own obsession. This is not the story of England's most glamorous king. This is the story of his descent into madness, cruelty, and decay. The story of how a promising young monarch became a living nightmare. A king whose death was not just physical, but symbolic. The death of a man who devoured everyone and everything to preserve his power. Yet once, he was beloved, England's darling, tall, athletic, educated, a Renaissance prince. He spoke languages, composed music, and dazzled foreign courts with his charm and elegance. To his people, he was Arthur reborn, a symbol of English glory. Crowned in 1509, at just 17 years old, Henry VIII promised a new golden age. He was everything his war-worn father was not. Youthful, charismatic, full of hope. England sighed in relief, but the seeds of destruction were already there. Buried beneath the polished surface was a restless ambition, an obsession with legacy, and a fragile ego terrified of failure. All it would take was a spark, and that spark came not from war, but from love. For kings, legacy is everything, and for Henry, legacy meant one thing: a son, a living heir to carry the Tudor name beyond time. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was royal, devout, and deeply loyal. But she gave him no surviving sons, only one daughter, Mary. As the years passed, hope faded, Catherine aged, and Henry's patience began to rot. Then came Anne Boleyn, brilliant, witty, ambitious. She was no ordinary mistress. Anne was the storm, the flame that ignited the king's obsession. But the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. And so the king, unwilling to be denied, did the unthinkable. He broke with Rome. Torn from centuries of Catholic tradition, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. It was more than a divorce. It was a revolution. Monasteries were dissolved, priests defrocked, gold and lands stolen from the church. Blood ran down the stones of abbeys once built for peace. Let them call it heresy, Henry said. I call it destiny. In 1533, Anne became queen, and England, now a nation torn from its spiritual roots, watched as the king's new wife swelled with child. But fate was not finished mocking him. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Disappointment turned to resentment. Anne miscarried several times. Rumors swirled: witchcraft, adultery, betrayal. In May 1536, Anne was arrested, accused of incest, treason, and adultery, charges most historians now see as political theatre. But Henry needed her gone. She went to the scaffold with dignity. Her final words were not of hatred, but of prayer. Then the sword fell, cold, precise, French style. Henry's choice, for it was cleaner. He married Jane Seymour just days later. She gave him the son he longed for, Edward, but at the cost of her life. She died shortly after childbirth. Henry wore mourning black, but only briefly. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 2 discarded. 1 died. Only 1 outlived him. But by now, Henry's heart had turned to stone. His obsession with legacy had consumed his soul. His court was filled with fear, silence, and spies. He executed those once closest to him: Thomas More, his dear friend and devout Catholic, for refusing to acknowledge his supremacy. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of his Reformation, was beheaded for arranging a marriage Henry didn't like. No one was safe. Loyalty meant nothing, only obedience. The king had become a god in his own eyes. God, who feared nothing but the silence of a cradle and the passage of time. By the late 1530s, the Golden Prince was gone. In his place stood something else, bloated with power, twisted by fear, haunted by his own shadow. Henry VIII, once loved, now ruled through terror. England had become a kingdom of whispers. Spies lurked in every hall, every chapel, every home. Speaking ill of the king was not just dangerous, it was fatal. Sir Thomas More, Henry's old friend, his Lord Chancellor, refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. He was arrested, tried, and executed. His crime? Silence. "I die the king's good servant," More said, "but God's first." The axe came down anyway, but the spiral didn't stop there. As Henry's paranoia grew, so did the bloodshed. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive northern uprising against Henry's religious changes, was crushed. Over 200 rebels were executed. Priests, peasants, even nobles, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Then came Thomas Cromwell, brilliant, cunning, and indispensable. He engineered Henry's break with Rome, orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries, and filled the royal treasury with seized church wealth. But Cromwell made a fatal mistake. He arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. The king, furious with her appearance, called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled. Cromwell paid with his head. No one, not even those who built the throne Henry sat upon, were safe. He devoured them all, like Saturn consuming his sons. Then came Catherine Howard, barely 17th, vibrant, carefree, and foolish. She was Henry's fifth wife, his rose without a thorn. But secrets trailed her. Affairs, letters, past lovers. When her infidelities came to light, Henry was devastated, heartbroken, then furious. She was dragged to the Tower of London. On the day of her execution, she asked for the block so she could practice placing her head. She was beheaded on February 13th, 1542, barely more than a child. By now, Henry's world had shrunk. His body had ballooned, a once athletic frame now crippled by disease, gout, and festering leg ulcers. He could barely walk, smelled of infection, and sat in custom-built chairs lifted by servants. But it wasn't just his body that rotted. So did his trust, his warmth, his humanity. His final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived him. She was wise. She kept her head low, played nursemaid, and survived. Henry continued to purge his court. Those who hesitated in their loyalty vanished. Some were tortured, others burned. Even nobles and bishops lived in dread of a sudden knock at the door. The English court had become a blood-soaked chessboard. And Henry, the player and executioner, by the mid-1540s, England was not ruled, it was held hostage. And behind the curtain of majesty stood a man unrecognizable from the youth who once rode into battle, jousted for love, and composed songs. He had become a monster, and monsters always fall. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was unrecognizable. The Golden Prince was gone. In his place remained a creature bloated by power, poisoned by paranoia, and eaten alive from the inside. Once admired for his athletic build and fiery energy, Henry had now grown monstrously obese. He weighed nearly 400 pounds. His legs were so swollen and ulcerated that they oozed pus and emitted a stench so foul it drove servants to nausea. He hadn't ridden a horse in years. Even walking was a challenge. He was wheeled about in custom-built chairs. Doors had to be widened for his frame. His armor had to be enlarged by the inch. The once proud king of movement and flair had become a prisoner in his own flesh. Doctors, terrified of offending him, poked and bled him. They drained his ulcers, lanced his flesh, and prescribed hot compresses and prayers. Nothing worked. He screamed in pain during the night, his roars echoing through the corridors of Hampton Court. But it wasn't just his body decaying. It was his mind. He became suspicious of everyone. He accused his closest advisors of treason, burned heretics, and watched from behind embroidered curtains as people were executed in his name. He passed laws that made it treasonous to predict his death, treasonous to speak against his marriages, treasonous even to talk of his health. England, by the 1540s, was living under a dying king's shadow, and yet Henry still obsessed over succession. His only son, Edward, was a frail child. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, born of wives he had cast aside or killed, were deemed illegitimate at various times. Even in death, Henry demanded control. In his final will, he carefully orchestrated how the line of succession would play out. But fate, as always, would have other plans. In January 1547, Henry VIII collapsed. His body was failing. His mind wandered in and out of lucidity. He was no longer the lion, only the echo of one. Those closest to him whispered of last confessions, but few dared speak openly. To suggest the king was dying was still punishable by death. And yet, death was now undeniable. His body had become monstrous. His legs were blackened. His ulcer burst, releasing a torrent of foul-smelling pus. The room reeked of rot. The smell was so putrid, the windows were ordered open, despite the bitter January cold. He died on January 28, 1547, alone, in agony, and without final confession, too weak to speak, too proud to ask. But the grotesque tale didn't end with death. During his funeral procession, his bloated corpse, improperly embalmed, began to leak. The wooden coffin cracked under the pressure. Royal attendants covered the floor with straw and cloth to hide the horror. One chronicler claimed that dogs were found licking the remains that leaked from the king's casket. Propaganda, perhaps, but fitting. For a king who devoured all, even in death, the earth itself seemed to reject his body. Henry VIII had reigned for nearly 38 years. He had reshaped England, torn it from Rome, dissolved its monasteries, married 6 times, executed friends and queens alike. And yet, in the end, his greatest enemy was himself. When the bells tolled for Henry VIII in January of 1547, they signaled more than the death of a king. They marked the end of an era soaked in ambition, fear, and blood, and the beginning of a kingdom trying to survive the ruins he left behind. His son, Edward VI, ascended the throne at just 9 years old. Sickly and frail, Edward was a shadow king, a puppet in the hands of noble protectors and Protestant reformers who pushed Henry's break from Rome even further. But Edward would not live long. Tuberculosis consumed him at age 15. Henry's great hope, his precious male heir, was gone before he could rule in his own right. Next came Mary V, Henry's eldest daughter by Catherine of Aragon. A devout Catholic, she sought to undo the Reformation, to drag England back under Rome's embrace. Her methods were brutal. Hundreds of Protestants were burned alive. Her reign earned her the name Bloody Mary. But even her fury could not unwrite what Henry had done. The Church of England was not so easily dismantled. And after Mary's death came the child of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, the daughter of a woman Henry had executed, became one of the most revered monarchs in English history. Brilliant, cunning, resilient, she ruled for 45 years, ushering in a golden age of exploration, art, and empire. And yet, the ghosts of her father never left her. Elizabeth never married. She never bore children. She knew too well what Henry's obsession with succession had cost. 6 women used, broken, and sacrificed at the altar of legacy. Friends discarded, faith destroyed, a country divided. Henry VIII's shadow stretched across 3 reigns. It redefined monarchy, church, and state alike. He dismantled centuries of Catholic tradition with the stroke of a pen, seized lands, rewrote theology, and replaced the Pope with himself. He wasn't just a king. He was a force of destruction and reinvention. To his supporters, he was decisive, strong, unyielding, a man who placed England above all else. To his critics, he was a tyrant, a murderer, a man consumed by vanity, lust, and fear. Both are true. That is the paradox of Henry VIII. He was neither entirely hero nor wholly villain. He was England's great contradiction. He was buried beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who gave him a son, and the only one who died before disappointing him. Today, Henry lives on in history books, television shows, and portraits. But behind the velvet robes and courtly intrigue lies the real man. A man who reshaped a kingdom to serve himself. A man who killed for love, ruled by fear, and died rotting in his own bed. The death of a monster is not just about the man's end, but the legacy he left behind. One carved in flesh, faith, and fire.